You may have heard about CityWorks Expo. For years now, we've been bringing people together to share big ideas for better places. Expo connects innovators across the community and around the globe through an ongoing series of events, conferences, and social media. And our goal is to inspire and support people like you, the ones who have a passion for making their neighborhoods, communities, and cities better places to live, work, and play. Check us out at cityworksxpo.com to learn more. Become a part of the Expo community and share your story. You never know who you will inspire with your big ideas.
We were given instructions, and one of them was to stand still. And you should know a couple things. First, I was voted most likely to start a revolution in high school. So I don't follow instructions well. So if those closest to me can just, shoo me back in the right direction so that we make sure that I'm keeping in the middle of the camera. So we're going to talk a little bit today about immigration law. It's what I do. I also left and went to Houston for a long time and came back. Grew up in Salem. And because this is an issue that isn't new to our area. I mean, we had a ton of folks coming into our community from Lebanon, from lots of different places, drawn by the railroad industry, drawn by coal mines. And so immigration law in the service of stronger communities, to me, really is about continuing a tradition within these mountains and within the mountain communities of really actively engaging on the issue of immigration. My grandmother, when she lived in North Fork, West Virginia, baked the unleavened bread, and we weren't Jewish. So there is a real strong connection, and I think a real deep need for empathy that some of our previous speakers had brought up, and I think those are important themes for us to continue as we go through this. So I'm going to try to put it into some context. And I'm going to talk about some issues that are critical, I think, to understanding why the current immigration system doesn't work. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how to think about reform differently. And let's start walking through this. So these are old editorial cartoons. These are things from the 1880s, 1870s, through the 1920s. And these themes repeat. I could have shown you editorials that were, modern in nature, that were similar to these. These editorials demonstrate these ideas that we have that somehow this immigrant worker is displacing the U.S. or the native-born worker. And in essence, bringing in cheap labor, diluting the job market, doing all of these things that really we consider to be difficult, problematic atrocities in terms of our labor market and the way that our job market works. But what's missing from these cartoons, and really what's missing from the dialogue that we have currently on immigration, is the discussion about the skilled worker. So if you look at all of these really old editorial cartoons, which, by the way, are much worse than anything we hear in political rhetoric today, these particular cartoons completely leave out the idea of the skilled worker and what it means. So in my opinion, these things are sort of a little bit of a distraction. The more we talk about the southern border wall, the more we talk about the undocumented population only, we tend to distract ourselves from where we are able to actually drive innovation, prosperity, and a degree of diversity within our communities. And in this particular, capacity, we want to do a couple of things. We want to retain talent. We educate an incredibly large number of foreign nationals at universities like Virginia Tech who frankly do not stay in the US because they cannot stay because they do not have a visa. We want to attract highly skilled workers from other areas to fill jobs that cannot be successfully filled by a native-born population with the same ease. And these are things like STEM professions. Hiring somebody in Indiana who knows COBOL is not the same thing as hiring somebody from, Bangladesh who actually is versant in Swift. So those things are important for us to consider as we begin to think about what this means for us as a community. Creating permanent options, permanent green card options for those who are educated here in the US. Is another critical aspect. And finally, permitting innovative investment. How do we actually make the systems of I want to start a company in the US, I want to come in, how do we make that system work? How do we make it work for a foreign national company to come into the US and actually build a plant in Rocky Mount? How do our economic development folks begin to think about how to attract those companies and how to engage in the dialogue on immigration on a regional and a national level? So let's look at a few things, and I'm going to tell you what these say. But basically, the stats have held pretty standard from 2011 to the present, that 28% of new jobs, or new businesses are created by immigrants, when they make up roughly 12% of the population. The birthplace of these folks is everywhere. We have companies in our region represented on this chart from Germany, from the Netherlands. Companies that are creating jobs in areas like Danville, which have been decimated in many ways by the sort of the last 20, 25, 30 years. So we want to see more of this kind of a job creation. We want to see more work in this area. We want to see these visas that we're going to be ready to go through work for these communities. In fact, these companies often struggle with those visa options. These companies, it's not just companies that are founded by immigrants, it's also folks who are at existing US companies that actually create, I think the numbers from the US Judiciary, the House Judiciary Committee or the Subcommittee on Immigration were something like 72% of all patents come out of, or have at least one foreign national inventor. And I think that's a really important thing to think about in terms of innovation and how we think creatively about who we want in the particular communities that we're in and how we can use that talent to the best use. Companies want the best people. In addition to that, 2009, and this is again about this brain drain. If any of you have read the book by Dr. Wadhwa, it's this idea of that we are in essence seeing an immigrant exodus away from the United States. 2009, foreign nationals earned half to 2/3 of all PhDs and almost half of all engineering and technology degrees or master's degrees. And this is the House Judiciary Committee's own reporting. So this is in part from USCIS and in part from, in terms of the SEVIS system and who's registered. 45% of those foreign students graduate and stay in the area where they went to school. So given our proximity to Tech and Radford and all these other schools that are SEVIS certified, meaning they accept foreign students, what does that mean for our particular communities if those foreign nationals have better access to visa options? So what happened to the rest? Let's take a look. If our goal is to retain talent and attract highly skilled workers, then the first thing we always want to go to is the H1B visa. How many of you have heard of the H1B visa? Okay, a good number of you. Then you might also have heard of the problem, which is that 2008 to 2012, there was a little bit of a lag in how many days it took to fill this visa quota. But the visa quota is 65,000 for a bachelor's cap, 20,000 master's cap. What that means is that this year, 220-some thousand people applied for 85,000 spots. It was filled in 5 days, and it's put into a lottery the first 5 business days. And what ends up happening is you're either picked in the lottery or you're not. And it's as fair of a system as you can have when you have only 85,000 visas. So it's important to think through that, because what it means is we're losing really creative, innovative folks. And we're losing them to places like Canada, and not to offend any Canadians. Do I have any Canadians in the audience? Who says H1B problems, pivot to Canada. Pivot is their particular program that sort of invests and makes sure that folks that want to invest in new businesses are able to. So we want to look at this because we are in essence feeling, in fact, Dr. Wadhwa says, we probably have 5 to 10 more years before we really feel the impact of this. Because just India last year granted something like a significant number more visas than the previous year, not to Indian nationals who don't need them, but to foreign nationals who want to go to India and begin to work and start businesses. So L1s. L1s are the visa types. How many of you have heard of an L1? I feel like I'm playing bingo, by the way. So an L1 is a visa type that we use for multinational companies. It says, hey, you're a company and you're in Germany and you want to come over here and create a company? Come on, let's go. And you're going to do that, and we're going to show certain factors that demonstrate that you're a legitimate corporation. The problem with this is, look at these numbers. We had a 6% denial rate in 2006. By 2014, 35% denial rate. And Chinese and Indian nationals are disproportionately represented in the denials. So this is simply not, this isn't even fundamental fairness at work. This is a system, while there may very well be fraud in visa applications, I'm not sure it's represented in the numbers of denials that are being afforded to Chinese and Indian nationals. And then there's this issue of permanent residence and what it means to be a permanent resident in the United States and what it means to be invested in that way, such that you know you're on a path to citizenship. This permits us to not just retain existing talent, it permits us to bring highly skilled workers into the US, it permits us to do all of these things that allow those folks to stay and really reinvest in the communities that they're in. 376,000 permanent resident visas are available each year, of which only each country cannot claim more than 7%. 4.3 million people, and I think this number is probably employment and family-based, but 4.3 million people waiting for green cards in 2013. Anybody see the New York Times article just posted yesterday about a gentleman who was suffering because he, in essence, was on an H1B, can't transition to a green card, and is, you know, in quite a predicament, and is going to have to go back to his home country and begin to wait in these lines because of some changes and some mistakes in the State Department's visa policy. What this means is 180, just if we look at just China, 180,000 students returned to China. Now, some of that may have to do with the Chinese economy, and some of that may have to do with the fact that our visa programs don't permit them to stay here in the US. So investor visas. Again, we want to basically allow folks to easily invest in companies and create companies in the US. I graduate from a four-year university. I go on to do my master's and my PhD here. I decide that I come up with some innovative way of managing semiconductors. Maybe I want to start a business and begin to pursue, you know, business opportunities here in the US, except even if I have a substantial sum of money to invest, it's incredibly challenging to do that. Why? Because the EB-5 investor system, which is the permanent resident investor system, it started in 1990, implemented in 92, if I think I'm right on those years. 7,600 visas was all we issued last year, or year before last. So that's an incredibly small number for a particular visa category that really, while it's under reform presently, and while we don't really know what this particular administration might do with it, this particular visa category could be incredibly helpful for creating regional centers, specifically surrounding manufacturing in this and other areas. Most of these projects are construction-based, and the reason that there's so few of them is quite simple. There's $1 million minimum investment unless you're in a targeted area of unemployment. There's incredibly low approval rates, and there's long processing times. So most of these are real estate investments, and most real estate investors cannot just sit around and wait a year and a half for them to be able to release the funding from escrow. So in essence, what happens is these visas over time are not used for projects where they're really needed. They're used for projects where they're, in essence, additional funding, not necessary to the project itself. And they're used, by the way, a lot by Chinese nationals who have students that are coming to the US and going to school, and the family's investing in let's say a property that, you know, they can then use as a townhome or other property for their child. So I think there's some real impact for our area in this particular visa category. Then there's a temporary investor program. There's only 62 countries that are participating. What do I mean? That means that we have a treaty with only 62 countries. And that means that India, and I put Venezuela in here for a specific reason, India's not on there, and Venezuela's not on there. We have received in the last 2 years, with the whole issue with Chavez and Maduro, we've received a number of folks from Venezuela into the US who are incredibly bright, incredibly talented, and incredibly stuck. And so that probably is the same story played over. I could have added 3 or 4 other different countries where the same issues were at play, where civil unrest or difficulty is creating some kind of exodus. That exodus is in essence to the US, and then we're in essence having a very highly skilled, highly intelligent population that isn't doing anything. Just last year, in fact, it was just last year, that if you came in with your spouse, let's say that I'm a foreign national on an H1B, and I come in with my spouse is not able to work up until last year, even if my spouse is a PhD and I'm a PhD. So you saw folks, disproportionately women, making choices between careers and coming to the US. And that's a really problematic quandary to find oneself in when you're highly educated and able to do a number of jobs quite well that perhaps we need here in the US. So what does the framework look like for this particular investment visa? This isn't really a hard and fast rubric, but it's the one that the consular offices use. And it, in essence, says if it's less than $500,000 of an investment, you'd best be ponying up 75% of it. On the other hand, if it's 500 to 3 million, then you'd best be ponying up half of that, and so on and so forth. Plus, there's some ownership requirements. Of all the things I've just described to you, this probably works the best. And it works the best simply because there is less regulation governing it. There's scrutiny, but there's less regulation. So we talk a lot about these walls, right? We talk a lot about these particular, and we've been talking about them for 150 years. We talked about the Chinese exclusion wall. In fact, that was our very first border policy, was to exclude the Chinese at our southern border. We in essence we talk quite a bit about the border at the Mexican and US border. But until we start really talking about this particular wall, right, that we're creating to talent and to innovation and to diversity, we're really losing something for our particular communities. And while I can't solve this particular problem today, I do want to take a few minutes and walk through some things that I see happening as a practitioner and as an advocate and as an activist on these issues that I think are important to note. If we're going to lead change on immigration reform, the very first thing that we have to do is begin to educate at a really fundamental, simple, but important level about how the legal system works and why, in essence, it's so difficult to come to the US effectively. And until we do that, we're really not even talking about the heft of the matter. We're really talking around it. We're talking about things that are, in essence, the distractions that I mentioned earlier. We have to avoid, I think, to some extent, and I feel like a little bit like my father's a Methodist minister, I feel like I'm preaching up here, but we have to avoid to some extent this tendency or this overt desire to objectify the person on the other side of that table. If we're going to educate, we have to be able to engage in a really consistent, helpful dialogue. It doesn't mean we can't really be very firm in our positions, but it does mean that we have to be able to hear the loss that the community is experiencing that is opposing a particular form of immigration reform. And the blame, while we could blame all day, there's a real fine balance that happens with this. On the left, what happens with immigration reform is that the left says, we're not going to give in on these specialized worker visas, we're not going to give in on this until we pass some kind of comprehensive reform. And in essence, on the right, we have a dialogue about whether those particular workers are taking the jobs of US citizens that are entitled to them. And again, I go back to my analogy that the difference is we favor and we value a culture of competition. And in this particular circumstance, when we are educating an inordinate number of foreign nationals at our universities, and those folks are really talented folks, we're really creating, I think, a little bit of an oversight. Something's happening in our blind spot that we don't necessarily see that we need to pay a little closer attention to. And that's that they're leaving in large numbers because the system itself is not helpful to them. And that's changed, in the last 20 to 25 years. We have to seize some degree of informal authority. How many of you have a formal position of authority in the room? How many of you have been elected, appointed, hold a position of power over a team, a group? Oh, come on. I know there's more of you out there than that. Those of you who have formal authority may also have informal authority in some other arena, at church, in your civic group. But those of you who think, I don't have any authority at all, probably have informal authority at least within a group of peers who look up to you and value your opinion. And one of the most critical reasons for having presentations like this is to begin this discussion and the dialogue and the back and forth about how we think through these issues. Finally, there needs to be, as we were discussing, and I think your presentation was, how do you begin to think about these issues personally? How do we begin to take some degree of personal responsibility and stop passing the buck? Because at the end of the day, whether my community thrives or dies is a function of a lot of things. But the only one I know about is immigration, right? I mean, at the end of the day, I know how to play spoons, but I also know how to practice immigration law. So that's the sphere of my influence. That's the sphere in which I exercise a degree of informal authority, and that's the sphere in which I act. And so to the extent that there is a conversation at dinner about this particular topic. My purpose is to go out and have that conversation effectively with each of you so that you can have that conversation effectively at dinner. It's in essence to provide the community with talking points that aren't biased, that really aren't even a polemic. This isn't political for me. This is very much the reality of how we look at our communities, how we think about those folks, and lastly, how we really relate to them from a place of empathy, not a place of superiority, but a place of empathy. Because at the end of the day, when you have someone sitting across from you who has been highly educated, whose family is truly extremely proud that they've accomplished their master's or their PhD at a university which, is without question exceptional, and I have to tell them, sorry, you didn't win the lottery. And, well, let's figure out, we have to end up getting very creative, but sometimes it doesn't matter how creative we are. We cannot find a solution for that person. And their only choice is to go home. And there was a statistic by and this is again, House Judiciary Committee, Subcommittee on Immigration. This was a statistic, for every 100 immigrants that we bring in, highly skilled immigrants, 267 American jobs are created. And that's some impact. That's some impact to our communities. And if you look at the companies started by immigrants, you're probably talking about a much higher number. So I think we have to begin to dialogue about these issues. We have about 5 minutes left, and I want that to be that. I promised Amy I would take up a few minutes and ask and answer any questions you have, and I really challenge you to challenge me. Because I think we all need to look at where our blind spots are. We all need to think through these issues and begin to have these discussions in small groups, over dinner tables, and in our living rooms. So thank you.